So now we want to move on and talk about some of the different visualizations that we can do. I pulled up a fresh version of this, the monthly product sales data that's available, so that we can create a graph with it, right? So this is, you actually probably have a fair amount of familiarity with it. Let's go ahead and let's select all of the data, every single bit of it, right? So we've got the column of months, products A, B, C, D, and E, and then all the different rows with all the different months to it. Oh, I was going to ask a question though. What kind of variable is in column A? That month variable. It's a variable, right? And it takes on a different value of January, February. What is the variable month? How would you classify it, right? Is it ordinal? Is it a ratio data? Is it an interval data? Is it categorical data? What kind of data is it? Is it quantitative? Is it qualitative? How about product A, right? Is product, and again, this is looking at product A's sales. Is that categorical data? Is that ordinal? Is that interval? Is that ratio data? Is it clear? Do you have a good sense of what all these variables, how you would classify the kinds of variables that they are? Okay. But actually what we want to do right now is do a visualization of it. So again, let's go ahead and highlight all the data. So, what did I just do? I just did a quick highlight of all of it. So I went to one of the corners of my data, and what I did is Shift, Control, and then right key. What that's going to do is that's going to push your highlighting all the way to the right of what you're doing. And then I did Shift, Control, down, and that pushed my highlighting all the way down to the bottom of my data set, or of the data that I'm in, right? So that's a pretty useful set of shortcut keys that you might want to practice with. So if, for example, if I'm going through a bunch of data, if I'm in the middle, if I want to get to the top right away, I've got this page up where I could hit the up button, but I can also do Control up, and it will automatically push, or Control down, push my highlighting the cell from the bottom, go from the bottom to the top. I can also, if I'm in the middle of a data set, middle of a bunch of data, I can do Control left, right, and I can go back and forth from the beginning or the end of mine. Especially with something like this. This is not a very big data set, or it's not got all that many rows and columns. That's what I mean to say. But it's pretty easy to go ahead and highlight that. But if I'm working with something bigger, that's a useful little shortcut key. Okay, so I highlight my data. I want to do some kind of visualization of it. So we do charts. When I've taught this in the past, almost everyone says, just go ahead and click the recommended charts to begin with, right? So I could just do that, but I want to spend a little bit of time noting that we've got a number of different types of charts. Column, bar charts, those are useful. Line charts, pie charts. We've got, what is this called? Hierarchy charts. I've also got some different statistics charts. Scatter plot, that's going to be useful, and I've got a couple of other ones. But again, we'll go ahead and do what the usual recommendation is when I teach this class, to just do the recommended charts, because it's actually going to bring up, I have no idea what this is bringing up. Did I lose it? Okay, so I have all of my data highlighted. Now if I go under Insert, Recommended Charts, it brings up, let's try to center that in my screen. It brings up, yep, a lot of those things that we were just talking about, right? So it's got, if I click this over to all charts, notice column, line, pie, bar, area, scatter, stock. I mean, we've got a number of different ones. Histogram, that's a useful one. And notice we've also got some different variations on the different categories, and it also does the little recommendations, right? So we're going to talk about some different visualization properties. One of the nice ones is, or one of the nice ways to approach this is to think about who's your audience. Your boss or your client, whoever your audience is, think about what's the information that they need to know from your data, and what's the easiest and cleanest way to communicate that data to them. Another way to think about that is, if you glance at this chart, what would someone think is the main points or the main takeaway, right? So This one is actually where I want to start with just doing a simple little line chart, right? It's got, we've got a bunch of panel data here, right? Because we're following a bunch of different products through different time periods. And so thinking about a line chart that stacks all of these different lines, stacks is the wrong word, presents all of these different lines, that's probably a very, very useful way, right? Where I can see which products are more popular in different months, which products are more consistent throughout the year, which products have more variability, which products are consistently low performers, right? Those are probably the main pieces of information that you'd probably want to get from that kind of chart. And I think that this line chart does a pretty good job of presenting that information visually to your audience, whether that's your client or your boss, whoever. It does a pretty good job of communicating it. To illustrate why it's better than other types. What is this? A clustered column. My goodness, right? I mean, try to piece this out in your mind, what's going on here. It's presenting information on different products, right? So I've got my blue column is product A, and it again goes through all the time periods. So I see that there's this pattern of the blue sales, and same with red B and green C and all that. Like, it's the same information being presented, but is this as clean and clear of a way to communicate who's doing really well, who's doing really bad, what kind of variability, who's got more of a cyclical trend in their data? I can see some information here, but I'm going to argue this is not the cleanest way to present that information. What's another option we could do? A stacked area chart. Oh my goodness. I think I hate these more than no, that's dramatic. I really don't like these, right? What I don't like about stacking data is that it's very difficult when you see something like, let's look at October to November. Notice that the area in green got smaller. Did the area in purple get smaller or larger? I don't know. It's really tough to tell when you've got that kind of change when we stack everything on top of each other. Whereas if I go back to this one, oh, actually, it looks like from October to November in this nice little line chart, it's a very subtle downward slope. But my goodness, can you actually tell that from November to December, or from October to November, that area in purple got smaller? Maybe you can see it. I think it's a lot more difficult. I think there's rarely, if any, good times to use stacked areas. Again, I'm an economist, so the way that I use data might be a little bit different than the way somebody who's doing management or accounting, and so they're definitely, these have its place. I'm just not a big fan because I really like to see the cleanest presentation of the information. And again, your audience, your boss, your client, they're also going to care about that as well. Same thing right here, right? This stacked, this is in a stacked area, this is a stacked column, same sort of thing. Some other ones I've got a scatter plot. My goodness, why? Why a scatter plot? What is it looking at the scatter of? It's got different colors for different products, and it's just got a mess. This is not really all that useful. And no, that's also not what we're let's go to all charts, and we might want to explore some of those. So I'm going to argue that this column chart, it's actually not awful, but recognize that there's a difference between these two based on what we're identifying with colors. In the first version, we're identifying products with a consistent color, right? Product A was all the dark blue, and here we're identifying months as colors, and so all of the Januaries are dark blue. This is communicating some information, right? It's absolutely communicating the cyclical pattern of the data for different products. You can see that. But is that the cleanest way to present that information? Again, think about how your audience needs to use the information, whether it's your boss or your client. What do they need to know? And their time is valuable, so don't waste it. Don't make them try to figure out what the message is. Figure out the presentation of the message that most cleanly represents it, right? The other thing that I'll put out there right now is this is not terrible. I don't think it's the best, but it's not necessarily terrible, this column. I mentioned the stacks one not being very useful. 3D. I remember playing with these a lot and thinking they were really cool to make some graphs, but can your boss easily understand what the message is about these different products? Absolutely not, right? So, yeah, maybe there are some limited times when using 3D is actually useful, but again, you want to make things as it's that KISS, keep it simple, stupid rule. The more simpler presentation, and usually that means two-dimensional. Just do that better so that your audience can more quickly get the message and not have to try to sort through that. Oh my goodness, that's even the worst, right? So there's a lot of different ways to present this. Is there anything else that we'd want to do? How about a pie chart? Can we do a pie chart? Yeah, that's actually counting up, I believe. Well, no, that does look like those are different sizes, right? So that's different, different amount of sales by different months. Again, not that useful. I'm going to argue that the line chart is actually the most useful. But notice there's a number of different variations that we could do on a line chart. I like this one because it's presenting each of them individually. A stacked one, I already mentioned this. I'm not quite sure the value of a stacked one that the value of stacked has. I know it does have some sometimes. What's different between this one? Or sorry, this first one? No, that is stacked. Between this stacked and this stacked. Do they look similar? What's the difference? Notice that top line in nope, not that top line. Oh. Notice what's going on with the vertical axis, right? So on this stacked version, what are we measuring vertically? It looks like we're measuring total sales, and think about some of those sums that we did earlier. Yep, that looks like what that is. What's going on with this one? Right? Now this is looking at a relative stacked chart where it's looking at the relative contribution up to 100%, which again, that might be useful in certain contexts, but I'm not quite sure that it does as nice of a job as some of these other lined ones. Oh my goodness. So putting some extra flair on it, that's what I think about it is with some of these other ones, is just adding some, oof, this is awful, adding some extra flair to it to try to make it a little bit more creative. Again, can your boss see what the message is? Can your client see what the message is? That's what you should be thinking about, is what's the easiest and best way to communicate the useful information to the people who need it for making decisions. It's going to be this, right? It's clearly going to be this. So, yep, I've already settled on this. And then, again, you may or may not, if not, I'm going to encourage you to play around with these things. Know easy ways to manipulate some of these things. So actually, I found that because I don't use Excel to do a lot of my research, I use some other statistical tools. I've actually found that my class is a whole lot better in describing some of these different options, right? But some of them are pretty straightforward, right? I've got my axes, I've got title to those things, my data labels, that makes things look messy, or doing a table below. Again, sometimes that might be a useful thing to add. Error bars, grid lines, trend lines. We'll talk about trend lines much more in the future, right? There's some different elements that you can add to this thing. We can also, oh boy, how do I get that so that that's in the picture so that you can see that as well, right? Again, if our rule of thumb is KISS, keep it simple, adding extra shading in the background, I would really question whether that's useful. So two reasons for that. Number one, is it necessary, right? If it's not necessary, if it doesn't contribute in some way to help your audience, your boss or your client help understand the information, then why are you doing it, right? Number two, just for doing shading and backgrounds and those kinds of different things, and this also applies to colors, think about who your audience is. Are they going to be looking at a digital copy of something? Are they going to be printing something out? Are they going to be printing something out in color or in black and white, something that you created in color, right? So you always want to think about who your audience is and create your designs in a way that is as flexible as possible. Unless you know for certain that you have control over the environment of the way they're going to see it, like if you're printing out a presentation and bringing it to them, then maybe you're on a little bit surer footing. If not, if you think there might be a couple of different ways that this does, or that the information gets used, then you probably want to think very, very carefully about just making things as simple as possible, right? So, and again, yeah, we've got a lot of different options that you can play with there. Did I accidentally turn these data labels on? I didn't mean to do that. And again, lots of different options that we're going to play around with in different applications. This was just meant to be the big overview of the thing. Okay, so that pretty much introduces things to the line. I brought up a clean version of the EEO data to work through on some different chart options. And again, there's a real nice presentation in your textbook that follows along with it. Again, we're going to think about, let's consider the males and females of all employees, not broken down by race and ethnicity, but just male, female, for all these different types of industries, all these different types of work in Alabama in 2006. So I'm highlighting all of this data, and if I go under Insert, what we want to play around with for a bit is the column. But before I do that, let me just throw this out there, that if you go under the recommended charts, none of these recommended charts are all that great. Well, actually, this one is not that bad, right? But some of those are really, really not great. But the point of this one specifically is to look at different column charts. So notice that, yep, I did that a little quickly. I went under this 2D column to make it very, very simple. And it somewhat looks like what's in the book, but it's a little bit misleading, right? So again, what's the main point of all of this data here? We're looking at the total number of employees, the male employees and the female employees across a number of different types of workers. Employment across different types of workers. We've got that first little set of 3 is the total employment, and as we found earlier, right, there was more males than females, but it also has it broken down by different kinds of work. Notice, though, all these different kinds of work total up to this first, so that first column is really, really, really driving a whole lot of what we see in this chart. Maybe if we got rid of it, it would be a little bit useful. So what can I do? One easy way that I can try to manipulate that is up towards the top. You'll see on your ribbon when you have one of these charts selected, chart tools, right? And there's a number of different things that you can do. Add chart elements, change colors. You can switch rows and columns and those kind. And again, some of these visualizations not great. Switch rows, column. There's a lot of different things you can do, right? And there's even for this formatting, some of those formatting options that you may have played around with before. But what we want to focus on is this one with select data. Because, right, we've got our all employees, males and females, and then we've got all of the different types of work listed out. And the nice thing is we can absolutely select or deselect things. And so it's really easy for me to just, I've got my data already selected, I've got my chart already configured, but now let's just go and do one slight tweak where I remove total employment, and boom, this looks like what they did in the book, right? And it looks like, again, what's the main point of this? If you had to try to communicate, this more cleanly communicates the differences in employment by gender across different industries, right? When we had that total there, it was really tough to see some of these, but now it's pretty clear to see the gender differences in employment in different industries, or different types of work, I should be saying, right? So again, is the main takeaway of some of these pretty straightforward. One of the things I'm going to question is, does all of this need to be here though? Does the blue column need to be there where we talk about all employees? Isn't that just the summation of males and females? So I think it depends, right? If the purpose is to see what's the relative distribution of gender, then I don't think that column, that first column of blue, total employment, is actually all that necessary. But if your audience, your boss, your client, or whoever your audience is, might care about the overall level of employment and which industries are larger, I mean, let's take these middle ones. Sales workers, it's got more females than males. Office and clerical clerical, it's got much more males, or much more females than males, right? The sales workers are a little bit more even, but still dominated by females. But if we look blue, those employment levels are not that different, right? If we just had the red and green columns, I'm not quite sure that it would be as obvious that those two types of work were almost equally represented by the level of employment. And so again, your book makes this really good argument as to why we might want to add as an option that data table below, right? We might want to play with some of the sizing on some of this stuff, right? But, oops, not table. Yikes, yikes, yikes. This surface is very temperamental with some of its clicks, right? Actually having some of those numbers might be useful. I might want to rescale some of this stuff so that visually this was a better balance of my color presentation and my number presentations. I always want to think about how am I balancing out the information that's being presented with the amount of white space and the amount of other information that's being presented. This balance is not really there, but I think if we played around with it for a bit, you might be able to get it close to something that looks like what they present in the book, which I actually think is a pretty good presentation of stuff. As a quick side note, we have in section 1, there's this data set called memory data. I wanted to explain a little bit where that came from. So at the beginning of each of the in-class versions of this class, in-person versions of this class that I did, I always divide the class in half, and I give them either 20 seconds or 40 seconds to look at some information and see how much of it they can memorize, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some information up on a slide, and if you want to go ahead and play along, you could do this, where either time yourself for either 20 seconds or 40 seconds staring at this information, trying to memorize as much as of it as you can, and then when the 20 or 40 seconds, whichever group you want to put yourself in, is up, go ahead and pause it, and not pause it, but put it to the side, and then see how many you can write down and compare your answers, right? You can just do this for fun. But in general, right, so we do this. This is the first one. And if you looked at this for 20 seconds or 40 seconds, when you're done, how many of those letters in the correct order could you remember? That's what this memory data, right? So I had a bunch of different students doing it, and I recorded their self-reported gender, and then the self-reported which group they were in, and self-reported what their score was in the first round, right? So that first slide was the first round, and it was how many of those letters in a row they could remember, and there was a total of 16. Then I do it again. You want to do it again? All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Again, take either 20 or 40 seconds to try to look at those letters and memorize what they are in the correct order. And when your time's up, put it to the side and check yourself, see how many you can do, right? And so part of the reason why I do this is this this whole argument about the cognitive process about how we learn information, right? Because right now this is 16 letters that mean nothing, right? Whereas this is less information, right? There's actually 5 pieces of information that you have to remember, but your mind has already chunked together these ABC, CBS, NBC, FOX, and ESPN as some different channels that you're probably familiar with, right? And so it's just conceptually, right? Your brain can deal with this smaller chunk of information because you only got to remember 5 things here, whereas you really are, unless you came up with some kind of nice little acronym for what this would represent, there's no pattern in that. And so as the data in the memory data shows, right, if you have on average, people did a whole lot better in round 1 or in round 2 than round 1, right? So we can take the average real quick. The average of this, I forget what it was. What was it? 7.07. So on average, oh boy, for the 28 students, the average number of letters they could remember was 7. And then round 2, oh my gosh, it wasn't 16, it was 15.18 because, again, some people couldn't remember all of those in quite the right order. And then again, we also did by different groups based on how many seconds they had to look at it. Do you think there's a correlation in that first round when it's just the 16 random letters, basically? Do you think that there's some kind of correlation between how many seconds you had to look at it and how many letters? How can we look at that? All right, so if we highlight those two columns of data, and then under insert, right, there's this nice little option right here of scatter plot. A scatter plot is useful when we're not looking at a single variable, but we're looking at two different variables with each other, right? And so again, there's a lot of different options, but just having the very, very basic, I've got a bunch of 20s and I've got a bunch of 40s, and it looks like those 40s, the people who had longer to look at it, they tended to have some students who were doing a little bit better when there was this small time crunch of 20 seconds, right? Some people did pretty well, but there was nobody who did really, really well. It really took that extra time. It looks like there's that kind of correlation between those two things. Correlations, scatter plots, we're going to use them. There's not a whole lot of variation in the thing that I was measuring horizontally. Notice real quick that the first column of information that I highlighted was seconds, and that's what went on the horizontal axis. It's always going to be that structure in Excel, that the first thing you highlight in a scatter plot, the first column of data, is going to be the thing that's being measured horizontally. Scatter plots are useful. We're going to use them in a number of different ways to illustrate a number of different things. I wanted to just very quickly hop back to this monthly product sales. And again, your book does a decent job of this. We don't use it that much in this class, but they do make note of it. So I wanted to make sure that you are somewhat familiar with this. And again, if you've taken PC apps, more than likely you are. But under the Home tab, right, if I highlight some data, there's this option of conditional formatting, and there's a number of different ways that I can do this, right? I like the data bars one, where it's the length of the bar that's being highlighted represents something about the underlying piece of data that it's got. Maybe that one shows it up a little bit better, right? Where it really shows like the cyclical nature of it. That kind of visualization is built into it, right? There's also the other one that gets used a lot are these, oh boy, what are these called? These aren't the color scales, not the heat map things. But still, right, it's the intensity of the colors and communicating something about whether the number is relatively high or relatively low. And just notice that, right, I was doing it specifically with product A, but if we do a wider selection of data with this whole thing, but we go back to the same thing, right, we could definitely see, right, those values in blue in column C are saying that product C is almost always below average, right? So the recommendation is, right, what you want to do is you want to think about who your audience is, whether it's your boss or your client. Might they be colorblind? Thing to think about if you are going to do some of this conditional formatting and include some of these different colors. Just what you want to think about is the red-green is one of the more common forms of color blindness. So again, you just want to try to think about who your audience is, a boss or a client, and you may not know if that's an issue, but you might want to think about different ways of presenting your data in a way that might be a little bit more friendlier to someone who has some colorblind issues. The other thing, there's a number of different ones. There's also these spark lines. Your book does a pretty decent job of describing what those are. These spark lines, right? So under the Insert tab, there's the option to add spark lines. You can do lines, you can do columns, win loss, those sorts of things. And again, my data range, I got to change that data range. Let's do our data range, not just F4, but let's do it for the whole column, and let's put them right there. And again, it does a nice little spark line, and I can even copy that down the whole thing, and it's just telling me this one maybe would have been better as a bar chart, right? But it's looking for all of those across all those different products. And again, it's just a nice compact little visualization that helps, that can help communicate information to your audience about how they need it. The last thing that we want to talk a little bit about go ahead and bring up the sales transactions. So think about for a second, what kind of data are we looking at? So we've got customer ID. We've got a bunch of different customers' IDs, and then we've got a bunch of regions. Notice that we're looking at what? A bunch of sales transactions from July 14th. And so these are sales transactions by different customers. We've identified the region they come from. We've got the payment type. We've got a transaction code, the source, the amount, the product, and again, this is product category, not individual product, and as well as time of day. Again, just to practice with some of these ideas, is it clear to you what each of these variables represent, the kinds of data? Is region a categorical variable, a ordinal variable, a interval variable, or a ratio variable, right? How about payment? How about transaction code? How about source? How about amount? Product? Time of day? You might want to think about how we would classify those different kinds of those variables. Okay, but what we really want to do is we want to practice just a little bit with this thing that we call pivot tables. Again, I think many of you have probably seen these, but I think it's always good to do a good refresher. We're going to try to keep it very, very, very simple, right? So what you want to do when you're doing a pivot table is you want to place your cursor within where you want to create your pivot table, right? So all this data, I want to use it, so I make sure my cursor is in it. That's all I'm saying. Insert. Under the Insert tab, there is an option for pivot charts. There we go. Under pivot tables, it was under the table. I've just got my shrunken down version, so it stays within the screen. When you have your cursor in a section of data, what it does is it automatically goes out to the extreme values. And so just double check, right? This is going to pull all the way from A3, which is where my data starts, all the way down to H457. And it looks like H457 is not a bad place at all for my data. Just realize that if you had at the bottom or at the end of some columns some rows that were doing like some sums or some averages, that you might need to make some adjustment on where the data comes from. Again, you can put it within this existing worksheet, or you can put it on a new worksheet. Go ahead and put it on a new worksheet. And what it brings up is something that looks a little bit like this. So what do we have? So what you probably notice right away is that you've got, there we go, that we've got all of those column headings, customer ID, region, payment, transaction code, right? All those different variables, or more generally, whatever the column heading was, that we've got those, and I can select those, right? They are able to be clicked or unclicked. And then down below, I've got a number of different things that I can do in my pivot table, right? And so this is just a table that I can use really easily for looking at crosstabs and a lot of different information, right? The important ones: column, rows, values, right? So let's swing back to the data real quick. So one of the variables there was the amount spent. Let's go and let's take amount and let's click on it. And if I click on it, it auto-fills to a place that might be logical and it might not be logical, right? So when we had that pivot table and clicked on amount, notice it didn't put anything into columns or rows. It did put something into values. But what did it put into values? It put the sum of the amount. Well, all right, so is it useful to know the total amount of these transactions over a given time period? Maybe. But it also might be useful to know what the average amount of transaction was, to get that number, right? So I did the drop-down menu and this value field setting. It's got a number of different calculations that it can do. And a lot of these are the formulas we talked through earlier, right? It could look at the sum of the amount. It could look at the count of the amount. It could look at the max and the min. Let's go ahead and look at the average of the account, right? So or average of the amount spent. So the average of the amount spent for each of those transactions was $39.94. Again, that's a pretty good little piece of information, but we could have pulled that out in a lot of different ways. But notice when we hop back to the data, we've got amount spent, but I've got different sources, right? Some of those were done from the web, some were done through email. Could I maybe look at the different average amount spent by those different sources? Let's go ahead and shift back to the pivot table. Those different sources was the variable. Let's go ahead and drag that down to the column and see what happens. Right? So what it did is it's still, again, creating the average of the amounts, because that's what we had in our values. But now the columns represent the source, right? So I don't know that I necessarily like all of these decimal places, right? Because really, 0.6 decimal places out when we're talking about spending money doesn't make any sense. Average amount that was spent on an email order, average amount that was spent on a web order, average amount that was spent on any kind of order. Right? So that's what a pivot table does, is it allows you to break down and look at these granular crosstabs in a much more sophisticated way. So that's useful information for a boss or a client, right? That people are spending more on email than what they were doing on the web. That might change the way that you want to do some marketing or something like that. Maybe not. Notice what else? We had different regions, right? I wonder if the different regions also had some kind of different association between the sources. Let's go ahead and let's take the regions. Where's my regions one? There it is. And let's drag it down to the rows instead of the columns. Oh my goodness. Hopefully this isn't too bad, but notice we've got in the East, right? In the East, on average, the East was spending $42. The East, on average, was spending $44 through email and $42 through web. Oh boy, I bet they weren't spending that much on email. I bet the web is driving a bunch of that traffic, since the average is so much closer to 42 than it is to 44, right? In the North, however, my goodness, in the North, the average amount was spent was way lower, but the North was spending a whole lot more on the web than what they did on emails. In the West, right, it's a much more dramatic difference going the other direction. In the West, they were spending a whole lot on email orders and a decent amount on webs. So what did we do? We just added this huge amount of sophistication and complexity to these numbers that we were doing with just some really simple clicking, right? And I can easily pull regions out of there, and instead of looking at regions, I could look at different kinds of products, whether it was books or DVDs, right? The difference between the web or the email orders, right? A lot of different ways that we can do crosstabs. This is the thing that I'm gonna caution you against. Can we add regions to the rows? We can. So what do we got? We've got, for book orders from the East through email, they were spending $51, whereas book orders from the East through web, those transactions were averaging $63. Be careful not to go too many layers into this thing, right? Because if you gave your boss or your client a chart like this, number one, what's the main point? Is there a clear point that they're supposed to get from this table? I totally grant you, there's a tremendous amount of information here, but I think there might be too much information. What's the main point that you want your boss, your client, whoever that decision maker is, to understand so that they can make better decisions? Sometimes throwing more information into a system, not better. Sometimes coming up with the right amount of information. That's what you should be aiming for, right?